When the scientist pulled back from the microscope, he didn't say a word. He just stared at the screen. Then he called his colleague into the room. Not because of what he saw inside a 4,000-year-old groove cut into granite. Because of what it meant, and what it meant rewrites everything. Chapter 1. The Wound in the Stone. There is a room inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. You've heard about it. Maybe you've seen the photographs. The king's chamber, its walls, its ceiling, every surface cut from granite. Blocks weighing up to 70 tons apiece, lifted into position, fitted together so tightly that the gap between them is too small for a razor blade. Not approximately, precisely. Engineers have measured these surfaces flat to within 1/1000th of an inch across slabs several meters long. That is not a rough estimate. That is a manufacturing standard, the kind of standard that today requires CNC machines, diamond-tip tooling, and industrial coolant systems running at full capacity. The ancient Egyptians achieved it 4,000 years ago. And for over a century, mainstream archaeology had one answer for how: copper tools, sand, patience. That answer never worked, and nobody wanted to say it out loud. Granite is not limestone, not sandstone, not mud brick. Granite sits between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, one of the hardest natural materials on Earth. It's made of quartz, feldspar, and mica. Minerals so resistant to cutting that even today, working granite is slow, expensive, and punishing. Every professional stonemason alive knows what granite costs in time and tooling. Copper sits at 2.5 on that same scale. Quartz, the main ingredient of desert sand, sits at 7. You do not cut a material rated 7 with a tool rated 2.5. That is not archaeology. That is not opinion. That is physics. Dennis Stocks, experimental archaeologist, University of Manchester. We ran the tests. We believed in the conventional model. The data didn't support it. The cuts were rough. The progress was almost nothing. Stocks didn't come in as a skeptic. He came in as a defender of the official story. He designed rigorous lab tests. Controlled conditions, proper documentation. He loaded copper tools with sand and pressed them against granite, just like the textbooks said the Egyptians did. The copper wore away. Fast. The granite barely changed. Progress measured in fractions of a millimeter per hour. Surface marks ragged, uneven, bearing no resemblance to the polished, geometrically exact surfaces found on ancient artifacts. He came out with data that quietly dismantled the answer Egyptology had been repeating for over 100 years. Not a different answer, the same absence of an answer now with numbers attached to it. Chris Dunn spent more than 4 decades as a manufacturing engineer. Precision aerospace components, CNC calibration, industrial tolerances. When Dunn examined ancient Egyptian granite artifacts in person, he didn't reach for a theory. He went quiet. He said what he saw wasn't merely impressive, it was industrial. The tolerances matched and in some cases exceeded modern manufacturing standards. Not roughly, not approximately, precisely. And then there were the drill cores, pulled from ancient sites around Egypt. Stone cores extracted from solid granite, using techniques no one has been able to explain. The spiral grooves left inside those cores descend at feed rates, the speed at which a drill advances through material that made generation after generation of manufacturing professionals set down their calculations and stare. A modern diamond drill bit pressed into granite leaves a specific groove signature. The ancient Egyptian grooves were different, steeper, faster, more controlled. Nobody could replicate them using the tools archaeology said existed. Nobody for 100 years. And then one scientist ran one test that nobody had bothered to run before. Chapter 2. The test nobody ran. In 2022, Graham Hancock made a phone call. Not to an Egyptologist, not to a historian. He called a material scientist, Dr. Mamdouh Gabr, a specialist in tribology, the science of friction, where and what happens at the surface where two materials meet. Gabr had never studied ancient Egypt. He had no stake in the debate, no career built on defending any particular answer. He was simply a scientist who looked at a hard problem and asked the only question that matters in science. What does the evidence actually say? They obtained permission to examine ancient Egyptian granite artifacts using 2 instruments, scanning electron microscopy and energy-dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. Tools that reveal surfaces at the molecular level. Detail invisible to the human eye, invisible to optical microscopes, invisible to every researcher who had examined those same surfaces across a full century of study. Gabr approached the instrument expecting exactly what 100 years of Egyptology predicted. Sand particles, copper residue, the chemical fingerprint of a softer material grinding slowly against a harder one. The scan came back. Nothing matched Dr. Mamdouh Gabr, material scientist. The wear patterns were wrong. The scratch profiles didn't match sand. I looked at the data again, then I called Hancock into the lab. Embedded inside cutting grooves made 4,000 years ago, hiding in plain sight, corundum, aluminum oxide, rated 9 on the Mohs hardness scale, one step below diamond on the entire hardness chart. The same mineral that forms rubies and sapphires in their natural crystal state, the same material that modern industrial manufacturing depends on every single day to cut, grind, shape, and finish the hardest engineering materials on Earth. Sitting there, inside stone cuts made before Rome was founded, before Greece had written its name, before most of what we call recorded civilization had produced its first complete sentence. It didn't belong there, and yet there it was. Here is why that changes everything. Corundum does not occur naturally in Egypt, not in any form or concentration you could use industrially. The nearest significant deposits lie in trade regions connected to Egypt only through long-distance exchange networks. Someone had to know it existed, know where to get it, know how to process it, what particle sizes work for cutting, what consistency the slurry needs, what carrier fluid binds it to the tool. That is not luck, that is not improvisation, that is systematic material knowledge, tested, refined, and transmitted across generations. Dr. Mamdouh Gabr. Using corundum effectively requires understanding mineral hardness at a genuinely sophisticated level. This was not lucky improvisation. This was material science practiced 4,000 years before anyone had a name for the field. The secret wasn't just a mineral. It was everything that mineral implied about the people who used it. But one finding under a microscope, even a remarkable finding, is not enough. Science demands replication. What happened next stopped everyone in the room cold. Chapter 3. The Workshop. In early 2023, Hancock organized a series of controlled experimental trials. A workshop. Granite blocks, copper tools, 3 abrasives tested head-to-head, veteran stonemasons working alongside material scientists, every variable documented, every result measured. Abrasive 1, sand the conventional answer, a century of Egyptology's best explanation. Result, roughly 0.5 millimeter of cutting depth per hour, the copper tools degraded rapidly. Cut surfaces were rough and uneven, nothing resembling ancient precision. Abrasive 2, quartz powder, marginally harder than sand, naturally available in ancient Egypt. Result, 0.8 millimeters per hour, slightly better, still completely inadequate, still no match for what the ancient surfaces show. Abrasive 3, corundum quartz slurry, the hypothesis the microscope had suggested. The room went quiet, over 3 millimeters per hour, 6 times faster than sand. The copper tools lasted dramatically longer. The cut surfaces came out smooth, geometrically accurate, clean. And then came the drill test. The corundum slurry produced core samples with spiral grooves, the exact same descent profile, the same signature that had baffled manufacturing engineers for decades. The grooves that copper and sand experiments had never once been able to reproduce. Right there in the workshop, cut fresh into modern granite, using ancient tool geometries and the recovered abrasive technique. Nick Giza, professional stonemason, 30 years in granite. When we switched to the corundum slurry, I could feel it immediately. The copper stopped fighting the stone for the first time in my career. Watching ancient methods applied to modern granite, I could actually see how they did it, not as a theory physically. In real time, 3 independent lines of evidence: microscopic analysis, experimental replication, quantitative material science data, all converging on one conclusion: the secret had been found. But the experiments revealed something else, something nobody had fully anticipated. The corundum slurry demanded skill, real, practiced, hard-won skill. Too thin it lost cutting power, too thick it clogged the groove, pressure had to stay consistent, feed rate had to be controlled. Every variable mattered. This was not a process you handed to unskilled labor and walked away. It demanded craftsmen who spent careers refining their technique, knowledge passed master to apprentice, generation to generation across the entire span of construction. Not workers, artists, not improvisation, tradition. They built the pyramids not because they had unlimited labor. They built them because they had knowledge that we lost. And the question that now hangs over everything is, when did we lose it and what else went with it? Chapter 4. The Gatekeepers. Hancock presented these findings at a materials science conference in late 2023. Not an archaeology conference, a room full of engineers, physicists, and materials scientists, professionals who evaluate evidence on its merits. With no professional investment in the official story of ancient Egypt, the response was largely positive. Dr. James Harold, a geological archaeologist with decades of research in ancient quarrying methods, acknowledged something significant. Abrasive slurries do not preserve in the archaeological record, they are used. They do their work, they vanish. Corundum traces embedded inside ancient cut surfaces may be the best physical evidence that will ever be recoverable for this class of technology. He called the methodology sound. The finding genuinely significant. Then the findings reached mainstream Egyptology. Some archaeologists engaged honestly. They asked the right questions. How much corundum would large-scale granite cutting require across the full construction timeline? Is there direct archaeological evidence of corundum entering Egyptian trade networks in the relevant dynasties? Could the traces found in those ancient grooves represent later contamination rather than original use? These are legitimate questions. Good science demands them. Hancock welcomed them. But a significant portion of the academic establishment did not engage with the science, they engaged with the name, Graham Hancock, the outsider, the man without credentials. The man they had spent 4 decades positioning as a pseudoscientist, whose findings could be dismissed on the basis of his biography alone. Their position was explicit. Hancock's involvement taints any finding regardless of scientific merit. Graham Hancock 2024 interview. They told me plainly, even if I was correct about the corundum, I should not be the one saying it. It was never about the truth. It was about who gets to hold authority over the story. Think about what that actually means. The grooves were always there. The scanning electron microscope has existed for decades before anyone applied it to these surfaces. The workshop test copper tools. Granite. 3 grades of abrasive could have been run at any point in the last 50 years. The secret was not hiding. The institutions that claimed authority over this subject simply never asked the question. And when an outsider asked it for them and came back with an answer, they attacked the messenger. Not the message. The messenger. Evidence does not care about credentials. The corundum hypothesis has continued gaining traction. Among engineers, among material scientists, among an increasing number of archaeologists willing to examine data on its merits regardless of who brought it forward. Because the granite does not respond to opinion. It responds only to physics, Chapter 5, what it forces us to accept. Let's be precise about what the corundum discovery actually proves. It does not validate every claim Graham Hancock has ever made. His broader proposals about lost pre-Ice Age civilizations remain contested territory. That conversation continues on its own terms. This is about one specific question. How did ancient Egyptians cut and finish granite with a precision that leaves modern engineers unable to account for it using the tools archaeology proposed? The evidence now has an answer. And that answer rewrites the entire technological profile of ancient Egypt. If they used corundum-based abrasive slurries, and the microscopic evidence says they did, and the experimental replication confirms it works then. They understood mineral hardness at a level far beyond anything Egyptology had assumed. They maintained long-distance trade networks specifically to source an industrial material that did not exist in the Nile Valley in usable form. They developed processing techniques for that material, grinding it to optimal particle sizes, mixing it to precise consistencies for different applications, testing and refining across generations. And they sustained that knowledge, passed from skilled hands to other skilled hands, master to apprentice, across decades, across dynasties. They were not operating on instinct. They were not lucky. They were practitioners of a sophisticated craft built on systematic material knowledge, thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution, thousands of years before we invented the word for what they were doing. They were not primitive. They were brilliant, and they have been waiting 4,000 years for someone to point the right instrument at the right surface. And finally, notice, Chapter 6, the failure that haunts us. Here is the part that should unsettle everyone who cares about how knowledge actually works. The answer was always there. The tribology laboratories existed. The scanning electron microscope existed. The controlled experimental framework, capable of testing ancient manufacturing techniques, existed decades before anyone applied it to this question. Nobody ran the test. Nobody examined 4,000-year-old cutting grooves with instruments capable of revealing what was preserved inside them. Nobody asked whether the stone itself might still carry the microscopic evidence of the tools that shaped it. Instead, generations of researchers repeated the same assumptions, until those assumptions hardened into accepted history, until questioning them felt like heresy rather than science. Settled stories are always more comfortable than difficult questions. Institutions built to preserve accepted narratives rarely become the institutions that overturn them. Once careers. Textbooks, Museum exhibits and university departments organize themselves around a particular explanation. The explanation becomes load-bearing. Changing it means admitting that the right questions were never asked in the first place. That is an uncomfortable admission, more uncomfortable, apparently, than simply defending a theory that the physical evidence has never supported. Hancock made one phone call, not to another Egyptologist, to a material scientist with no investment in the outcome, no career built on the consensus, no reason to confirm anything other than what the stone actually showed. And the stone showed everything. The proof was always there in the granite, in the grooves, in the microscopic mineral traces left behind by craftsmen who died 4,000 years ago, not knowing that the material they pressed into ancient copper tools would one day testify on their behalf. They were never waiting to be discovered. We were waiting to be ready to look. Now ask yourself this. If an outsider with no formal credentials after 40 years of being professionally buried by the institutions that claimed ownership over this question could make one phone call and unlock what a century of scholarship missed, what else is sitting quietly inside museum collections right now? What other ancient technologies have been dismissed as impossible simply because nobody ever examined them with the right instrument? How many forgotten techniques remain hidden in stone, in bone, in metal, in fiber preserved in microscopic detail, waiting for someone willing to ask a different question? The history of this planet is not a settled document. It is a living investigation, and investigations don't end, they just change hands. The greatest mystery was never how the pyramids were built. The greatest mystery is why it took us so long to ask the stone. If the answer was hiding in plain sight for 4,000 years, what does that say about the answers we're not looking for right now? Drop your theory in the comments and subscribe, because this is not where the investigation ends, it's where it begins.